Hello, everyone. Just want to make a quick announcement in regards to the party following the talks. That will be to the right of the escalators as you descend. I don't know what the name of that place is, but the requirement is just make sure you have a badge, whether it's an attendee, a student, some kind of ShowMeCon badge that'll allow you access to the party. We're going to get started with Christopher Campbell here. Chris is a security researcher, penetration tester, and former operator on the U.S. Army Red Team. He contributes to the PowerSploit project, and I think even as of today became the lead developer on that project. So, Chris holds a master's in information assurance from Campbell College and a multitude of certifications that he prefers not to be held against him.
All right, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? All right, this is PowerShell and you using Microsoft's Post-Exploitation language. All right, so you've already heard about me. Biggest thing is I'm PsExec on Twitter, and my website is obscuresec.com. There's lots of security and PowerShell related content there. All right, I want to lead with this. So I've been using PowerShell for maybe 4 or 5 years now. It's awesome. Every security conference I go to, I get this sentiment. No hacker uses Windows. Microsoft's terrible. We all use Linux, which is true, but it's not where you start. It's where you land. So if you're a pen tester, you don't really land on Linux boxes all that often, so you need to understand your environment. And if you do choose to be a Microsoft Windows guy or girl, there's nothing wrong with that, and the community is just being stupid. So ignore the InfoSec hipsters who say you can't use Windows. All right, so PowerShell is for hackers. So DEF CON 18, Dave Kennedy gave a talk with Josh Kelly that was awesome. And although in my office at the time we were already using PowerShell, we weren't using it in the ways that they introduced. They showed you how to dump hashes with PowerShell and how to create a bind shell, all native with native PowerShell. They really showed how the execution policy would really not stop anything. So that's where both Matt and I like to go back and say that that's where we really got into it. When we left DEF CON 18, we decided to take PowerSploit and make it a lot better and give it back to the community. So PowerShell itself and security community is gaining a lot of popularity. There are a lot of people that are developing security tools here right now that in PowerShell. So PowerSploit is a project that that Matt Graber started when we worked together, and he wrote the majority of the code, and I wrote a couple things. He's kind of moving on to other projects, so apparently I'm taking that over as of today. PsExec mod is Carlos Perez's tool. It's a module with several incident handling, post-exploitation, very similar to the stuff that's in PowerSploit, but a little different. There's PsExec, which they probably have the biggest development team. I think there's 10 or 20 people that are working on that, and that is awesome. Talk to Ben 10. He's in the back. If you want a demo, if you're a defender or an admin and you want to add security with PowerShell, that's probably the easiest and fastest way to do it. One of the early popular hacking tools with PowerShell was Nishang. It was designed for the small teensy devices. So that's still being developed by Nikhil. And it's also utilized heavily. There are a lot of PowerShell-related modules in Metasploit within Dave Kennedy's social engineer toolkit. Recently, the Veil framework. Anyone familiar with Veil? It's a AV bypass and avoidance framework. They added a lot of PowerShell stuff that's starting to rival the amount that's in PowerSploit. And several others are using PowerShell as well. But we're still going to run into the scumbag Steve Python developers who decide to install Python as a post-exploitation mechanism. So they get on a box and they want to run commands to figure out what's going on. Instead of learning Windows, They instead install Python on their customers' machines, which is terrible and why you should learn PowerShell. PowerShell is easy. I mean, to learn all of it is difficult, but to start and use it today, it's very, very easy. It's already installed in the environment, so if you land on a Windows box, if you're a pen tester, or if you're a network defender or an admin, PowerShell will help you do your job better. So it's used by administrators a lot. So if you're a pen tester, I have found vulnerable scripts. So it is possible to write a vulnerable PowerShell script or tool. But you can also write powerful security tools. And it's got tons of ways to help in incident response and AV avoidance. And I'm going to talk about a lot of those. So this just happened a few weeks ago. Did anybody see this? There have been maybe 3 or 4 public malware samples involving PowerShell in the last 3 or 4 years. There have been several discussed in the last week. So it seems to be gaining popularity for malware authors. So this one was called PowerWorm, and that was the spreadsheet. So it just kind of hoped that you would click Enable Content, and then the PowerShell would run from Excel in the macro, and it actually pulled down the Tor binaries and then used Tor as its command and control out using a .onion private address, which is pretty nifty. But if you actually reverse the code, because they scrambled it a little bit, it's really simple. It boils down to maybe 20 or 30 lines. They were able to create this malware that was wildly effective, and that's pretty crazy in and of itself. So let's dive right in. Blue is the new black. That is the Windows PowerShell. If you've got your laptop and you want to pull up PowerShell, start run, PowerShell.exe. We'll go over a few things, and you can kind of play around as we're going. But it's not just a shell. It's really, I break it down to those 4 things. It is hundreds of commandlets, and those are growing all the time, which are supposed to replace like ipconfig, netsh, wmic.exe, all these other admin tools that had different ways of interacting and different outputs and different everything that didn't work together. PowerShell is the glue that is taking all of these tools and putting them together in one single interface. So the scripting language is obvious as well. It is a much better language than Batch, and we'll get into that. One of the huge things for security people is that it gives you, with the scripting language, full access to the .NET framework and all the legacy COM objects that you may have used in VB. So in addition to being a VB replacement, PowerShell gives you access to .NET. And finally, the way that I often use it is as a C# wrapper, a way to take a very complex binary and shove it into memory without ever writing that binary to disk. So I'll show you what that looks like as well. All right, so commandlets. There are useful commands and utilities that are already built into PowerShell. You can write your own commandlets and install them, and each version of PowerShell gets new commandlets. So we're going to go over some basic ones. In no way in an hour can I go over all of these several hundred commandlets or the ones that you would use for whatever project you would set out to use PowerShell for. I'm going to go over the ones that I use a lot, and hopefully that kind of gets you started. They're intuitively named with a verb singular noun syntax, which seems insane. If you've scripted in any other language, this will feel weird. Get, it starts pretty much anything. Get member. We'll go over those. And the final thing is, all the commandlets output objects. So you have to handle those objects. Nothing is designed to solve the final product for you. You have the power to decide, I want to put this in a spreadsheet. I want this to be HTML. I just want this specific part of the information, and then I want to convert that into a string. So if you're used to Linux or Unix, and you're used to taking text and parsing it and passing that, grep to sed to awk, this is going to feel a little painful at first. unless you really wrap your head around the fact that they want you to use the objects and to pass the objects along. All right, so if you've got a Windows box open, you can check out some of these commandlets. These are what I like to call the discovery commandlets. Get verb probably isn't really a discovery commandlet, but if you're having trouble figuring out what the verb is to go with the noun, there's two examples. Get command, searching for the term random, and get random is a commandlet that I use a lot. It's pretty cool. Get help can also help you find commandlets as well. Get member gives you a lot of information. I got an example of that. Get help, the comment-based help that PowerShell uses is awesome. So when you write a function and you run that function, it's able to parse the help out of it and extend that help to anyone who's using PowerShell. All right, task-based commandlets, get child item. And in the previous slide, there was get alias. So get child item is alias to dir. So if you do dir or ls or several other variations, what it's actually running is get child item. There's also get content, get process, invoke expression. If you're starting out, you're going to see a lot of people using invoke expression, and the actual PowerShell developers cringe. That's really where a lot of the problems come. So if you're not hacking, like you're not doing something evil, you probably should not be using invoke expression. I use it all the time because I'm an evil hacker. If you are an admin, you should not use invoke expression. And then another one that I like to use a lot is test path. So you can test to see if the folder exists and then create it, or see if something's there. So that the examples that are there, you can see that Python 2.7 is installed on this particular box. 3.2 is not. Get content gets you the content of. You could read in a file into a byte array with get content. It's very powerful. And then invoke expression to pop calculator. Invoke expression gives you the ability to call external commands. All right, formatting. So you're going to do the task, then you're going to format the output, and then you're going to output the output. Is kind of the flow of everything in PowerShell. So I use format list in the alias FL star all the time. Format list will give you everything. Sometimes PowerShell will decide that you don't need some of the output, and it will truncate some of the properties and methods. So FL star is a good one to know. So I'm actually going to pop out and show you. So we can run, I can't see anything. So get process. So it creates this nice table. But is that everything about the processes? Yes, no, probably not. So if we wanted to see what else, we could shove get process into a variable. I'm typing with one hand, forgive me. So that variable is now an array because you have all of this object data. So we can index into that array pretty simply. So the ARM SVC, the Adobe update service, was the first process running. So then we can pipe that into FL star. So this is format list. So now we can see all the things for each one of the processes, if that makes sense. So now I can go in and pick out which one of these I actually care about, and then actually return that data. So if all you cared about was when the process was started and the name, you could then just select those two things and output that instead of what the default what PowerShell chose for you. Does that make sense? Yes? Awesome. All right. So the point of this slide is to don't kill puppies. That's a very cute puppy. Outhost is an outputter. You should probably never use it. There's only one specific use case that almost no one will ever run into, but it's used all the time. If you go out and just Google Outhost, you'll see millions of scripts that use Outhost. And the developers don't want you to use it because Outhost gives you the interaction you're used to from Linux. It is writing out to the console, but that's not an object, that's a string. So you're removing a lot of the output and the capabilities of PowerShell by using Outhost. All right, so outfile is how you could output to a file. If you want to look at all the output commandlets, get commands with the asterisks will help you find those. So this is what I was talking about before, get service. Then you can use a convert to HTML and then outfile that into an HTML. So that gives admins a lot of power, not so much for hackers, but cool nonetheless. All right, the PowerShell providers. This is something that I didn't really know where to put this, but it's something that you really got to understand. You can actually treat the registry, Active Directory, SQL Server. Once you use the provider, once you've installed the provider for whatever you're trying to index into, you can then treat it like a file system. So you can actually CD into HKLM and walk through the registry as if it were a file system, enumerating it, learning how it works. It really speeds up a lot of scripts when you know that you can do this. So you can walk through your OUs within Active Directory this way. You don't have to learn SQL queries. If that's something you don't know how to do, you can use the provider, load the database specifically, and then enumerate it that way with your script instead. All right, so as a scripting language, it is technically a replacement for VBScript. I think it's a whole lot more. It's got everything you would expect, but the emphasis is on objects, not strings. So one of the ways that I use PowerShell and all my friends use PowerShell that most people really don't understand is I never run a PS1. It never happens. On my box execution policy is set to not allow PowerShell to run. I run PowerShell all the time with that set that way. You don't have to write everything into a PS1. You can run it directly from the command line. From cmd.exe, you can call PowerShell.exe and put your script there. Or I often just paste everything into the interpreter. So I bring up the blue box and I just paste and I can hack away that way. All right, so objects versus strings, we talked about this. So we're declaring a string. We're declaring the variable string equals, this is a string. Obviously, it's a string. Once you've done that, that variable has properties and methods, specifically a string property of length. It's always there. You can call it. So that gives us that this is a string is 16 characters long. If you were to append a character, it would know automatically that it was 17. You don't have to count the number of letters. It's already there. So there are methods, and there are tons of methods. To find them, you would run get. So you would take the variable string and then pipe it to get member, and it would give you all the properties and methods. So in this case, we can use the method to upper. We can call that, and it'll take all the characters and make them uppercase. All right, so I'm going to go through all the basics of PowerShell. Again, this fits really nicely in a 10-day class, and we've got less than an hour. So I'm going to move through this stuff very quickly. The slides will be available on my website. I'll put that link up at the end. So if I lose anybody, which I don't think I will, it's okay. You've got plenty of time to go and look at the slides again. So there are environment variables. I like to enumerate the environment variables by just starting with $env, tab, 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 until I find what I want. There are built-in variables. You'll use that top one all the time. The $_ is the object that is in the pipeline. So if you want to do something or see a property or call a method for the object that's in the pipeline, you just add a dot on the end of that and go from there. There is a default arguments array variable, args, and you also use true and null. So at the bottom, if you look at any of my early scripts, you'll see that I cast. In PowerShell version 1, PowerShell made some funky decisions for you. So if you don't give it the string casting, that variable, it would make a best guess. In this case, because I put quotes around it, it would know that that's a string and make it a string. In PowerShell version 1, it did some funky things, so I always casted everything. Now we're on PowerShell version 5, lots of updates, lots of fixes. I don't really do that anymore because it's pretty smart. But if you do run into bugs, that could be where it is. All right, arrays, or for Python people, lists. So PowerShell is really cool. You don't have to explicitly declare a variable as an array. It'll figure that out for you. So that's how you declare an empty array. There's a shortcut for numbers. So that's something that I use in a script. Like if you want to verify that it's a valid year between 1900 and 2015. You could also explicitly put the contents of the array in the array, and then to get the contents out, you use the bracket and then the number starting at 0. Does that make sense? We've done that a couple times already. All right, operators. We're kind of going to fly through this. The biggest problem that people new to PowerShell run into is they try to use an assignment operator for a comparison. So if you want to compare two things, you use the dash, EQ being equal, NE not equal, GE greater than or equal, GT greater than. So that's the only real mix-up. Everything else is pretty standard. So conditional logic, if something is true, so the first condition, if the first condition equals true, that is equivalent to the second one, the else if, the condition 2. If it's going to be true, you don't have to actually compare it to true. It'll just move on. It'll meet the condition. There's an automatic true in there. Switch, if you've got lots of conditions and you don't want like 45 nested if statements, you can use the switch. There's support for each, for while, and do until. I got to be honest with you, I kind of do whatever I'm thinking about, and I move on. There is a science between the different types of looping logic and when to use what, but I don't really care all that much as long as it gets the job done. So those are how to use for and a while loop. All right. So the next part, we've gone through the scripting language. The next part is .NET and COM objects. Being able to use .NET is huge. There's really nothing you can't do in PowerShell. If it could be done in a binary in C#, you can accomplish it in PowerShell. And you could pretty much accomplish it easily. What you see in that screenshot is the integrated scripting environment, which I'll talk about soon. But the latest one has IntelliSense and tons of other features. So as you're typing, it's giving you all the .NET objects. And that's how simple it is to add a .NET object to your script that you can then use. So you could scroll up and down, find the one that you want to use, and then call it. So here's one that I use a lot. I use the system.net.webclient. You can drop the system and just go net.webclient. To download things, so to create my own little wget. So what this is doing, and unless you're a hacker, you should never do this, it is going to a website, downloading presumably PowerShell, and then immediately executing it in the current running PowerShell process. So this is the start to a lot of bad things that I do with PowerShell and that hackers do with PowerShell. So I put that on here for two reasons. If you see that and you're investigating some crazy script that may or may not be malicious, that's never good. Or if you're researching a script online, and part of that script maybe goes out and grabs 7-zip and then runs it, that's probably not something you want either. But does that make sense? Yep. All right. So there are lots of good COM examples. I don't really know why I chose this one looking at it now. But one way is to interact with the firewall, to interact with Excel itself, Internet Explorer. There's lots of things you could do with COM. This one's kind of particularly nasty. I released some proof of concept malware a couple years ago in PowerShell at ShowMeCon, and this was a part of that, where what this is doing is holding down the volume up key for forever, because that while true is always going to be true. So if you then wanted to play a sound, no matter what they did, like disable, it would enable and bring the volume all the way up. So that stinks for them, but that's a lot of fun to play around with. All right, so PowerShell is also a C# wrapper. You can take any C# and just drop it into a couple lines of PowerShell, and bam, it's a PowerShell script. So all you have to do is follow that syntax and then use the add type commandlet, and your C# code will compile using the csc.exe C# compiler that comes with .NET, and it'll be executed. However, if you're a hacker or you want to contribute to PowerSploit, which would be awesome, we've had lots of community contributions, we don't really accept any script that does this. From the offensive perspective, one of the remnants that you'll leave on the box, so if you're an incident handler or an admin and you're interested in seeing what happened, csc.exe will leave the actual source code that was compiled in some logs on the box. So if you're an attacker, you really don't want to hand over, decompiled source code. So we avoid doing that. Matt Graber wrote a blog post for the Hey Scripting Guy TechNet blog about using how you interact with the Windows API. And the third one is how to use reflection so that you never actually write the source or the file itself to disk when it compiles. All right, the power of the pipeline. So the pipeline's awesome. That's really where PowerShell derives the most of its cool factor, aside from the .NET stuff. You can take any commandlet and then pipe it to another commandlet, and as those objects are passed, you can filter those objects in between each one of the commandlets. So that's awesome, but one thing you have to do when you write your own functions is create them so that they can use the pipeline. So you have to put a start and a process block in order to do that. All right, so the integrated scripting environment, there's really not much going on that matters. I know you probably can't read that in the back. Maybe you can, but this is the new one. It's got 3 panes, so you can do your research over here. You got a little scratch pad for you to actually build your script or function, and you've got the ability to run it. This is free, and although you have to enable it on server OSs, on Windows 7 it's already there. Just type PowerShell_ISE. That'll pop up. It's got a debugger. It's got access to all the help. There are 4-pay PowerShell products, and I have paid for them in the past. But I no longer do, because the ISE has pretty much added all the features that I was paying for in the older products. So when I give PowerShell-related talks at HackerCons, I kind of have to go over this first, because there were a lot of references in hacker books to PowerShell early on that said the execution policy stopped everything, PowerShell is not going to be good, blah, blah, blah. There are a million ways to bypass the execution policy. One of them is to put bypass execution policy on the command line, and it will bypass the execution policy. So that's built in. Microsoft clearly said that it's only to prevent you from clicking a PS1 file and running it. So basically to prevent the I love you worm. But that's how simple it is. So that base64 encoded string you see after ENC, which is just short for encoded command, is calling IEX calc.exe, and it pops the calc. And on that box, the execution policy is set to not allow any users, not allow any PowerShell execution. All right, so how hackers use PowerShell. So I like to call it PowerShell Golf. It's a game I play with a few of my friends. We send around scripts to see how small we can make them. I'll go over what that looks like. So in order to bypass the execution policy, we're going to run everything at the command line. You can either have a really small script, or you can host and stage your script, or alternatively, you could compress, which was the way that Dave Kennedy and his friends used in their talk at DEF CON. All right, so you're going to use all the aliases you can find to make everything small. You're going to create one-letter variable names, remove all spaces to make your script as unreadable as possible and as small as possible, because cmd.exe has a 8,191 character limitation. So your script cannot be bigger than that, plus all the other parts. So if you're using like Wimic to execute this remotely, all of that plays in as well, so you don't have those characters. So let's take a simple script block that I wrote on the plane that will use volume shadow copy to copy off the system and SAM running as admin. So you don't have to get to system. You can do this as an admin using PowerShell. So that's what the script looks like, and ultimately it's going to write SAM and system to cdemo. That's really not a long script in reality. You could just pop semicolons at the end of each one of these lines and execute this at the command line. But instead, I went through the process of shrinking it and then encoding it in base64 so that I can run it at the command line like that. And you see both files were copied successfully as admin. So that's a lot of how I use PowerShell as a hacker. Alternatively, you can use a staged approach, which I've advocated in the past, and there's a PSH web delivery module in Metasploit. So that is how Metasploit deploys PowerShell scripts, is by staging them on a web server, and then the command that you're calling on the box is just grabbing your PowerShell and then running it. So interestingly, almost every script is available through the staged approach already on GitHub. So if you're an attacker and you get on a box that can reach GitHub, you can grab whatever you want, including PowerSploit, and execute it that way. So the base64 trick that I use, Lee Holmes, one of the Microsoft guys that works on the PowerShell team, he does the security for PowerShell. He shared this on Twitter, and I mentioned this a couple years ago at a talk, and I still don't understand why this works, but it does. From PowerShell, if you call cmd waxy echo and then give it a script block, it will base64 encode your script in a way that PowerShell can understand it. And then you just call the .split method, giving it, so if you want to know how to use cut, essentially for PowerShell, that's it. You just use the split method. We're delimiting on space, and then we want the second in the array, which is 0 and then 1, to get the string. So then we want to execute. So I'll give you a second. Does anyone know what this does? It does. It goes to a bit.ly address. That bit.ly address is invokes shellcode, which it calls after the semicolon, a part of PowerSploit. And then built in is the stager for interpreter reverse HTTPS. So this would be all an attacker would need to run at the command line to fire off a reverse interpreter HTTPS shell to themselves of whatever address they supply there. So we're going to talk about different ways to use PowerShell, different ways I've used and seen PowerShell. First is actual exploitation with PowerShell. So the first thing, when you get some sort of command injection in days gone by, you would have to download, first thing you would try to do is download a binary to then run your binary. So you create your backdoor and then upload it. Now you don't even have to do that. You could just call PowerShell with your script, and your backdoor is in memory, and AV has no opportunity to even see it go by. So on the previous slide, there's not an AV product in the world that's going to stop that reverse shell. There's just not. If you find one, please hit me up on Twitter. I'd love to know when the first time an AV cares about PowerShell. Because to our knowledge, the only thing that flags in PowerShell right now is the malware sample that I showed earlier, that actual PowerShell script, because that malware author decided to write it as a PS1 to disk and then execute it. That actual script does, in fact, flag several AVs. So with PowerShell, you can easily interact with MS SQL, any sort of web servers running on a Windows box. So here's one that I like to use as an example. This is a feature. So if you were able to log into this particular appliance, one of the things you could do is configure a system command. So then you just pop in your PowerShell command and hit test, and bam, you got your shell. I didn't have to upload anything. So it does help in actual exploitation. I've used it for years in phishing. I guess I'm a PowerShell phishing hipster. Before malware was doing it. If you've ever seen this top screen, I'm sorry. That means I've hit you. I've been using that for a long time, and now several variations of that. That is, of course, not a real thing. McAfee Secure Data Loss Prevention. So that's a splash screen that I present on the spreadsheets that I send to people. And what it does is the actual macro is hiding the content that they want until they hit enable content. So then they get the content they want, and it runs my PowerShell, which will be a stager. And all of this is on my GitHub if you want to play around with it. So there's obvious post-exploitation. Every network is different. One of the things I like to do on every engagement is to talk to the CIO and find out what information he's trying to protect in the CISO, and then that's what I target. So there may be similar ways of getting to the point where you're on a box, but once you're on a box, the path to find whatever's important to that company is going to be completely different. So that's where PowerShell comes in. It allows me to go after, if it's a database, a database. If it's not, if it's in some XML file, then I can use PowerShell to try to locate that. So if I can get something simple as like what the name of the file is, I can use PowerShell to search every single box to find out where it is. If I'm looking for R&D data from some developer and you have 700 developers, I'm going to run out of time before I find, what you're trying to protect. With PowerShell, I can very quickly automate that and within a few minutes find out where that stuff is. I'll show an example of enumerating AD. Locate administrative users is a way that I've used PowerShell for a long time. So you've got a local password for all the local boxes. You can then leverage that to go find where the admins are to steal their creds. Scrape intranet websites. PowerSploit has ways of dumping hashes, screenshot, capturing packets, keylogging users, all native in PowerShell. Most of you probably care more about the defense and the incident response. And that's where there's been a real lull in the PowerShell development community. It's like all these offensive tools have come out, and then everyone's like, oh, PowerShell is evil. But it's because the defense and the IR community have kind of lagged behind releasing anything useful so that people realize that it's actually more useful than it is harmful. There's a lot of things you can do in the realm of incident response very quickly. So if you figure out exactly what a specific malware or a specific actor is doing, you can then find out, within a matter of moments, every box that they're on very quickly using PowerShell. So for triage, it's excellent. All the VMware automation is there for you to be able to restore services very quickly as well. So here's an example of, again, something, a situation you may find yourself in. The top domain computers, the variable domain computers, is actually using a shortcut type accelerator for the ADSI searcher, and that is returning every computer that is in the domain. So now you have an array that you can iterate over with for each and check to see if malware.exe is in the all user startup. If that's how you detected it on one box, you can very quickly detect it on every box. If your enterprise is, several million computers, this is going to take forever. So you're going to have to look into the jobs and other ways of multiprocessing with PowerShell. All right, defense. So you can create a simple IDS, which I've seen used very effectively. You can automate hashing of every binary on a box and submitting that to VirusTotal to see if something VirusTotal doesn't know about, so you know where to investigate. You can automate log review and analysis. You can easily generate random-ish passwords and audit security settings. So I'm down to 5 minutes, so I'm going to fly through this last little bit. But this is a function I wrote called find MSF PsExec. On face value, it's a terrible idea, and I specifically put this in here for that reason. You should never write things that are so specific to a security tool that it causes you to miss tools that were custom written. So there's a completely different approach I recommend, and that's on my GitHub, where you can look for any network logins that may relate to past the hash attacks. So in this case, there's a specific signature of the length of the service name that the Metasploit framework and its PsExec module use. So we can find that, and we can use getWhenEvent, or getEventLog in this case, or getWhenEvent is another one, to quickly search through the event log to see what time, what user name was used, and what machine name it actually presented, and then you'll be able to tell that that module was used against you. All right, if you want to learn more, these are 3 books that I recommend. I'm not being paid by any of the authors to say that. I genuinely like all 3 of these books. PowerShell and a Month of Lunches is up to its up to PowerShell version 3 in a 2nd edition. It's awesome. You don't have to take a month to read it. You can fly through it in a day. Do all the actual labs that are in that book. Once you do that and you want to step up and start building security tools or tools in general using PowerShell, their next book, Don Jones and Jeff Hicks's Tool Making in a Month of Lunches, is awesome as well. I actually carry that around with me a lot of times. It's got great information on error handling and a lot of other things that we didn't talk about today. And then Lee Holmes' PowerShell Cookbook. You can't carry that around with you because it's like 9 million pages. It's a huge book. It's on its 3rd edition. That's kind of the way that I would work through those. If you're already used to using PowerShell, pick where you think you fall in. Carlos Perez is teaching a class at DerbyCon. If you've never been to DerbyCon, it's one of my favorite conferences. It is awesome. It's such a great time. Registration's open right now, and the training class is open right now. I've sat through his class the last 2 years. It is excellent. This year, he's going after intermediate level, so he's going to fly through the basics and get right into the meat of using PowerShell to solve problems. Again, if you want to check out all this stuff, on my next slide, I've got the link to where this will be. But just very quickly, I've explained why Dave Kennedy is awesome and what he's meant to PowerShell security community. Carlos Perez is another one who really advocates the safe use of PowerShell, not just offensive, but also defensive. One of my best friends, Matt Graber, who started PowerSploit. Joe Bialik has contributed a lot. He talked at DEF CON last year. Lee Holmes is one of the core people within Microsoft's PowerShell group. Matt Johnson and Ben 10 have created a project that is awesome and gaining steam very, very fast. And then Ed Wilson is the scripting guy. He writes all the PowerShell TechNet articles. And then Jeff Snover, is the original developer of PowerShell. And for someone so important and so busy, he spends a lot of time on Twitter answering questions. So those are great people in the security / PowerShell community. The slides will be there on my blog at /p/presentation slides. It's not currently there. When I get back to the room tonight, I'll upload it. I'm ObscureSec on Twitter and on Gmail. and I love getting questions. If you've got a difficult problem and you just, want help, I get those emails all the time, and I certainly don't mind them. If I do, I will let you know if I don't have the time. So if you want to send me stuff, that's great. And then this is pretty much what I get from all my coworkers, because again, I'm a security researcher. I don't work on a Windows box at work, and neither do any of them. But they make fun of me because I talk about PowerShell a lot and how awesome it is. With that, that is all I have, and I will take your questions. Go ahead, Ben. Right. So there are tons of IDS signatures. So his question was whether using PowerShell is helpful coming from Linux to attack Windows in evading IDSs. There are lots of signatures that are looking for the PE headers, that are looking for binaries coming across the wire. If that binary never comes across the wire, you're not going to trip those signatures. So starting with immediately executing PowerShell is a lot better, and you're going to bypass all of those signatures. That being said, I have seen recently that IDSs are putting in signatures specifically for PowerSploit, specifically for invoked shellcode. So if you're going to do it, you should use GitHub, which has HTTPS. SSL is going to protect that. As long as they don't have a SSL stripping proxy, you'll be able to get through that way. But all in all, I've never flagged. To my knowledge, I've never flagged an IDS using PowerSploit or using PowerShell. I've written entire backdoors in PowerShell, so everything, it's using Windows eventing, and I've talked about that in previous conferences. And to my knowledge, I've used that on Fortune 500 companies, and they're still calling back right now. I'm on active engagement. So I think it certainly the defense has not caught up. The IDS signatures are not there to catch it. So there's lots that you can do to slow things down, be truly asynchronous. Sometimes I check in once a week. If you're careful to set things like user agent strings, make sure that at least the browser, Chrome, Firefox, is running at the time. You can blend in with traffic really easily. And PowerShell gives you the ability to do all of that. Did that answer your question? Any other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, so using get child item, it doesn't. I have not run into that. So you're saying when you search for something using dir essentially within PowerShell, the item is there, but PowerShell doesn't see it? So Word documents are tricky because of the format. It's actually XML. So yeah, unless you're using the search indexer, it could be very easy to miss something that's in just a Word document as far as plain text that's in like a docx file. That's slightly more difficult than searching, a standard XML or a flat text file. Are there any other questions? Nope. Well, thanks for attending, and I'll see you guys around.